Good evening. Welcome to this episode of Cocktails with a Curator. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director, and Peter J. Sharp, Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you for joining us already for 62 episodes of Cocktails with a Curator for more than a year. Most of what we do at the Frick, in terms of research, in terms of programming, is thanks to your support and thanks to your generosity, the members and everyone who donates to the Frick. So thank you for this. We're reaching the end of our financial year at the end of June, on June 30th. And if you would like to donate to the annual fund, you can do so by clicking on the right, and we would be very, very grateful for that. Thank you. For those who come and visit Frick Madison, one of the very first paintings that you see on the second floor at the beginning of the installation in the area dedicated to Northern European art, which is art north of the Alps, in the areas, the geographical area that is today the countries of Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, you find a small little painting on the left, which is a tiny panel painting by Pieter Bruegel the Elder, one of the most important northern artists of the 16th century. This was a late acquisition by the museum. It entered the collection in 1965, so long after Henry Clay Frick had died, and it was acquired by the trustees and the director of the museum at the time. It is signed and dated at the bottom left. Here you see Bruegel's name very clearly painted on the bottom of the panel with the date 1568, which is just a year before Bruegel died. The little painting is a grisaille. A grisaille is a monochrome painting, very limited use of colors. In this case, it's black, browns, and whites. And as we will see, this is directly linked to the world of printmaking and, of course, also to drawing. There are very few works by Bruegel outside of Europe, and this is one of them, and so very fortunate to be able to show this painting. It represents, as we will see, 3 German soldiers. And because of that, I am drinking a Radler. And a Radler is a very typical cocktail in Germany. Radler means cyclists. And versions of this exist, of course, in other countries. In the Anglo-Saxon world, this would be known as a shandy. And in Italy, for example, it is known as a bicicletta, a bicycle. It is equal parts of lager beer and lemonade. But of course, it can be done with a number of other soft drinks, other sodas, ginger ale, and the strength of the drink, the ratio of the lemonade versus the beer is something that is up to different people's taste. I usually drink half and half. And this is because, of course, these German soldiers in Bruegel's painting and Bruegel himself would have mainly been drinking beer at the time. I doubt they would have mixed it with lemonade, but in honor of them, I'm drinking my Radler. Cheers. The small painting entered the Frick collection in 1965. But it comes originally from one of the most important collections in Europe in the 17th century. We actually don't know who it was painted for, and we don't know where it was between 1568, when it was painted, and the first half of the 17th century, when it first appears in the collection of King Charles I of England. Charles was one of the greatest collectors of the age, and he assembled in London and in the royal residences of England one of the greatest collections of the time, not only of paintings, but also classical antiquities and a number of other objects. In the inventory of 1639, the painting, the Bruegel painting, appears in the Palace of Whitehall. Here, of course, you see Charles I in one of the famous Van Dyck portraits of him. And we don't know exactly how Charles got hold of the painting. One of the inventories of the Royal Collection mentions that the small Bruegel was a gift by Endymion Porter, who was a diplomat and a close friend of the king, who had been ambassador, had been on a diplomatic journey to the Netherlands. the inventory mentions that Endymion Porter gave the painting to the king as a gift. However, on the back of the Bruegel painting, there is a mark with the initials CP, which were the initials used by Charles when he was Prince of Wales before he became king. So the dates of Endymion Porter's trip and the possibility of him giving the painting to Charles as a gift doesn't quite match. It seems very likely, because of the mark, that Charles already owned the painting earlier on before becoming king when he was Prince of Wales. Anyway, the painting remained in the royal collection until the 18th century, but not without some interruptions. Of course, Charles I is also known, apart from his art collection, for the turbulent times that led to the Civil War, to his beheading, and to the institution of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, and the subsequent restoration under his son, King Charles II. The Bruegel was sold during the Commonwealth sale in 1653, and it was acquired by a private individual and then only later restituted or acquired back, we're not sure, by Charles II and returned into the royal collection. It remained there until at least the first half of the 18th century. It appears in a number of inventories. It is then moved to Kensington Palace, and it is inventoried as being at one point in storage. And this shows very directly, very clearly, the fame of Bruegel through this period of time. A great artist in the 17th century, but by the 18th century, very much out of fashion. It seems that the painting then belonged to a secretary of one of the kings of England, possibly given to him as a gift. And then it went for a number of collections in England. And as far as we know, it never left England between the 17th century and the 1960s. In 1960, the painting reappeared on the market in Wingham, near Canterbury, and it was bought by a dealer from Ramsgate and then subsequently through the dealer Agnews, acquired by the Frick in 1965. Pieter Bruegel the Elder is one of the most significant and important painters who was active north of the Alps in the 16th century. This is a very beautiful and famous drawing by him in the Albertina in Vienna, which shows the artist and the connoisseur or the collector. It is probably meant to be a satirical work, but it shows, of course, the prototypes, the kind of the typical view of the two figures. So on the left, the disheveled, creative genius of the artist who holds his brush and is in the act of painting. On the right, the collector, maybe the connoisseur, the critic, with his thick glasses, and of course, putting his hand into his purse with the desire to buy the work of art. It has been said, we don't know for sure, but it's probable that this is also a self-portrait by Bruegel. And so this is one of the rare images and the only one by the artist that we would have showing what he looked like. We don't know exactly when Bruegel was born. In the early 16th century, we don't know exactly where. He starts being active as a painter in the late 1540s, early 1550s, and he dies in 1569. Most of his career is spent between the cities of Antwerp and Brussels in Flanders, in today's Belgium. But in the early 1550s, he spends probably a substantial amount of time traveling south, down to Italy, definitely in Rome, probably all the way to southern Italy, with the intention, it has been said, of traveling to Sicily. There are a number of drawings recording some of the sights that Bruegel saw on the strip. But Bruegel, of course, is best known today for his depictions of peasants. This is the peasant's wedding, and these are the type of scenes that we usually think Bruegel is creating. Scenes that are very rich in details, often very funny and humorous details, but also often imbued with allegorical or moral significance. Bruegel also worked on subjects of religious scenes, but the religious scenes like this one, for example, the building of the Tower of Babel, become really an excuse for these fantastic landscapes that Bruegel depicted, and as some of the greatest things he ever produced. So here is the great towering mass of the tower being built, but what is extraordinary is the fantastic landscape with the sort of minutest details all the way down to the horizon in the background. And of course, in the foreground on the left, the stonemasons at work on the blocks to build the tower. Bruegel is an artist whose sense of observation is remarkable and astounding even for us today. Arguably the best works by Bruegel are the set of the seasons or the months of the year. 5 of them survive today. It is unclear if originally there were 12 or most likely a set of 6. So there's probably only one missing. These are large panels that represent different moments in terms of the seasons of the year. Probably each panel was meant to be identified with 2 months of the year. Here is one of the 3 in Vienna. 3 out of the 5 are in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. This is winter, of course. This wonderful snowy, icy landscape. The hunters are returning from the hunt on the left with a rather meager results. The wonderful detail of the dogs, the sort of famished and somewhat defeated dogs who are trying to hunt in the snow. And on the right, again, the wonderful detail of the ice skaters on the frozen lakes below. A 4th painting, which represents early summer, is now in the Lobkowitz collection in Prague. And this again shows a number of peasant figures in the sort of early summer landscape, the moment of haymaking. And the only one of the seasons outside of Europe is the harvesters at the Metropolitan Museum here in New York, which shows, of course, the height of summer and the harvest in the fields. This is arguably one of the most important old master paintings in New York City, and it is a truly extraordinary work of art. I've spent many hours at the Metropolitan lost in contemplation of this painting. Again, the extraordinary bird's eye view down to the far distant landscape, the men at work in the foreground, but also the central area with this group of peasants resting under the tree, presumably in the middle of the day, at the height of summer, the height of heat. They're resting, they're eating. Bruegel is really an artist who presents details in such lyrical and poetic ways. He is an artist that encourages all of us to view his paintings for sustained and prolonged viewing and noticing all these wonderful details and these wonderful effects. In this case, also the sort of beautiful, sort of foggy, distant landscape towards this body of water, possibly the sea. Bruegel was also an extraordinary draftsman and very involved in printmaking. This is one of my favorite drawings by Bruegel, which shows this group of figures holding these large baskets. And they're wearing these remarkably strange outfits with these sort of hoods and sort of things protecting their faces. This is because of the figures' job. These are beekeepers. And of course, this is a protection against the bees as they move the beehives around in this landscape. We don't know if this was just a finished drawing by Bruegel done as a work of art by itself, or if this was preparatory for an engraving or a print that wasn't made, or even for a painting. But there are a number of very finished drawings by Bruegel of this kind. Our painting, of course, relates to the world of Bruegel's drawings and Bruegel's prints, mostly because of its monochromatic nature, but also because of its size and its subject, which was very directly linked to printmaking at the time. As I mentioned at the beginning, these are 3 German soldiers. There are only 3 figures in this painting. They're all doing slightly different things. Their costumes are very similar, but the man on the left, seen from the back, is playing a drum. The central one is holding a flag, a standard. The one on the right is a fifer playing the flute. Everyone at the time would have recognized these characters as landsknechts. And landsknechts were a type of mercenary German army, foot soldiers of the time. The word landsknecht actually means servant of the land. So here they are with their typical swords. Here is the one that you see very clearly in the foreground on the drummer. Their hats, they have these plumed hats that are often, usually, worn on top of a second headgear, which is a net, a fabric net over the hair, on top of which then the hat would be placed. The fifer has a slightly different hat, a fur-trimmed hat. But again, you see that the costume with the sort of slashes in the fabric, the sword again, which here appears in the back rather than at the front, are very typical of these men. Bruegel probably took inspiration from a number of prints. This is a print, much earlier print from 1519 by Lucas van Leyden, showing the so-called dance of Saint Mary Magdalene. There are a number of couples and figures doing a number of things in this print, but in the middle ground at the back near the tree in the center, you see a drummer and a fifer. Very similar in many ways to the depictions, not quite the same costume, but similar in their actions to the ones in the Bruegel painting. Here is another print, slightly later from the 1530s by Jacob Bink, which also shows this engraving 3 landsknechts. And again, you see the same combination of the standard bearer, the fifer in the center, and the drummer on the right. So why would you have these 3 typical figures? Now, landsknechts were always accompanied by these 3 figures at the head of their groups. Mercenary armies existed in Europe all the way back to the Middle Ages, and they were usually Swiss mercenaries, but later on, as in this case, also German. They were paid by whichever ruler needed an army. In the 16th century, the landsknechts were used by the emperor and by the King of Spain, which, of course, for a large part of the 16th century, in the person of Charles V, it is the one and same person. Charles V was both King of Spain and Emperor. Charles uses the landsknechts on a number of occasions and a number of great battles that he fights and wins, and a number of other rulers also use them before and later on. But the landsknechts were always headed by the standard bearer, which, of course, after the captain, was one of the most important figures of the militia, of the group. And of course, he held the standard they were fighting for. And he was accompanied by 2 musicians, a drummer and a fifer. And that is really to sort of enliven the marching of the soldiers, but then also to encourage them to get into battle and to fight. So the representations of landsknechts are often related to these 3 figures as a group together, as in this case. And of course, also in this print by Bink, you have the figure from the front, the figure from the back, the figure in the background, in a slightly different order and with slightly different roles than the Bruegel. Here is another 16th century print of landsknechts, and here again you see the slashed fabric of the sleeves and the trousers of the figures, the plumed hats, the fifer, the drummer, the standard bearers. Many of these costumes would have been immediately recognizable, and these figures, to Bruegel's public at the time, and even probably later in the 17th century. Now, the landsknechts, of course, were known for their fierce fighting and battling. As I say, they were foot soldiers, usually armed with spikes and large swords. And they become very famous in 16th century Europe for a rather dark moment in the history of Europe, which is the sack of Rome in 1527. The Emperor Charles V, for a number of reasons, unleashes his mercenary army on Rome and basically pays them by allowing them to sack the city and take anything they want. And so for several weeks in the spring of 1527, Rome is sacked. Many buildings are destroyed. They're set on fire. Here you see, for example, in the background, a view of the Tiber with the Castel Sant'Angelo, where the Pope took refuge, and you see the smoke and the flames of the sack around it and fighting on the right. And of course, this represents one of the key moments of the sack in the center. Mercenary armies were very much part of European life until fairly modern times. And one of these armies still exists, and of course is the Swiss army of the Pope, the Swiss Guard. And the Swiss Guard was created in the early 1500s by Pope Julius II. It is always said that the costume, of course, of the Swiss Guard was designed by Michelangelo, even though there is really no evidence for that. But the Swiss Guards, as it still exists today, is composed of young Swiss men. They have to be Swiss citizens. Right now, they have to be between the age of 19 and 30. They have to be unmarried, and they have to be Catholic. And they are in the service of the Pope as his private bodyguard and as the army in charge today of defending the Vatican. It is the only last survival of this tradition, which, as I say, goes back to the Middle Ages. But Swiss Guards existed in a number of other countries in the 17th and 18th century. The King of France, especially, also had Swiss Guard protecting him. These remain, of course. Landsknechts and a number of other mercenary armies of the 16th century don't exist anymore. Bruegel painted, as far as we know, at least 3 grisaille paintings, so 3 black and white monochromatic paintings. This is one at the Courtauld Institute of Art Gallery in London, which shows Christ and the woman taken in adultery, a gospel scene. Of course, very similar in technique to our landsknechts, but very different in terms of subject matter. And the third and the largest of the 3 is the death or dormition of the Virgin. So again, another biblical gospel story. In this case, this is also in the United Kingdom at Upton House, a country house in England. The 3 grisailles by Bruegel were brought together in 2016 in a beautiful little exhibition by Karen Serres, which for the first and only time reunited all 3 of Bruegel's grisailles. We don't know if more were made. And we don't know what they were painted for. They're clearly not a series. They're different formats. They're obviously very different subject matters, especially ours. It is unclear if these were preparatory for engravings, in which case no engraving survives after ours, or more likely they were paintings in their own right as sort of single works of art, painted probably for specific patrons and for reasons that are unknown to us. What is the moment represented in our little Bruegel? Is this just a march through the countryside of the landsknechts led by the drummer, fifer, and standard bearer? Or is it a more dramatic moment, the sort of entrance into battle? Is this the moment where they're preparing for battle? The standard bearer is raising the flag as the others incite the army to fight. We don't know. And what we don't know either is if this is just a painting representing a genre scene, a scene of everyday life, 3 soldiers, 3 figures that Bruegel would have observed in Flanders at the time, in the same way that he would have observed peasants or beekeepers or ice skaters on the lake. Or that is it imbued in some way with a moral meaning of some kind or an allegorical meaning? We're not entirely sure. But the fact that prints survive of this subject from Europe at the time shows that it was a very popular subject and something that was represented in Northern art a number of times. It is still a mysterious picture in many ways. Many questions around this little work are still impossible to answer, but more research hopefully will allow us or our successors to be able to find out more about this work. Research of these works is, of course, very, very important. We find more information as people study them and try to answer some of these questions. Of course, we're very proud to have this Bruegel at the Frick. It's not clearly as important or marvelous as the Harvesters at the Met, but it is the only Bruegel grisaille in the United States and one of the very few paintings, autograph paintings by him in this country. Thank you for joining me this evening. As I said, it's been more than a year that we've been working on Cocktails with a Curator and that we've been sharing these stories with all of you. It has been an incredible experience, and it has been a real pleasure to share all of this, our research, our love for these works of art with all of you. And the response from the public has been absolutely extraordinary. And for this, we're very, very grateful. The program started very much as related to the pandemic. to the closure of the museums, to us staying at home and not being able to travel. After more than a year, the light seems to shine at the end of the tunnel. We hope that we're all going in the right direction here in New York City, but also across the United States and in the rest of the world. We are heading, it seems at least, we hope, in the right direction. Many things are now possible again. Of course, museums have been open for a while and now are welcoming people from all around the country and abroad. Frick Madison has been open since March. And we're all beginning to travel again and to go back to our normal lives. So as summer is approaching, we will be bringing Cocktails with a Curator to a close on the 16th of July, in the middle of July. So we have 3 more episodes after this one, which will bring us to 65 episodes, 65 weeks that we've been sharing this journey with all of you. And again, we're so thankful for you to follow us in this, not quite with a drummer and fifer and a standard bearer, but maybe in some ways, I think this painting could be somewhat allegorical of Amy, Giulio, and I. I kind of can see the 3 of us working as a team, leading all of you, all of us in some way, marching through this dark time of the pandemic. In the next 3 episodes, Amy, Giulio, and I will say our goodbyes and we'll present 3 last works. And we look very much forward to these next 3 weeks and to seeing you again for the next 3 episodes of Cocktails with a Curator. Cheers.